So today we will be going over bioterrorism and weapons of mass destruction. You're going to note that there's a lot of similarities between this and last week's hazmat lecture. However, we're looking at more of the weaponization of some of these chemicals and biological agents versus just their natural use. We will look at a couple quick other things as far as going a little bit more detailed in some of the specifications of where or classifications of these chemicals and biological agents. Particularly, we're going to a little bit deeper dive onto the biological agent side of things. So, with that being said, we will go ahead and start this. History of biological agents has occurred throughout history as far back as 184 BC. So, when Hannibal ordered that pots filled with venomous snakes be thrown onto the decks of enemy ships, and then they would all abandon ship, and he got himself some new cool ships. And ever since then, I'm sure they used it prior to that, but that is one of the first recorded versions, and they've used it all the way in the Middle Ages, where they would catapult dead bodies that filled with the plague, or cows and other dead animals and things over castle walls to cause biological warfare and all that fun thing. So definitely something that has been going on for a very, very, very long time and is still a obviously concern to this day as they continue to do it. The delivery methods have gotten somewhat more enhanced. Keyword is somewhat. Still use some pretty interesting ways to get things done. All right, that being said, continue on. Acts of terrorism can pose significant risk to civilian populations. If, for example, a cross-duster plane like the one pictured here were to have a lot of that biological or chemical agent and go and fly over the strip, for example, delivering all that agent, it poses as we can quite imagine a significant issue as far as the widespread effects, and particularly with biological agents. Chemical agents in the short term, biological agents are a little bit more dangerous in the sense of how long it will stay around and then cause issues for other people. So see this being a pretty big issue right there. So there's a list of biological agents, and they're categorized A through C, A being the most potent, C being the least potent. An example of A would be anthrax. And we'll go over a few more examples in the list on here, but just know A is the most potent and most dangerous, C is the least. Category B agents second highest, and moderate illness have a lower death rate than category A, and an example would be Q fever. Category C agents, third highest priority, they include new pathogens that could be engineered for mass dissemination in the future that potentially cause a high rate of death and sickness. Nipah virus is an example of that. And we'll continue on. So here's a list of several of these, and we can look at some of these ones that you may or may not be familiar with. Anthrax, very high up there. Botulism, decently. Heard of that. Also heard of Botox. They use the same toxin to paralyze things. Plague, Pestis, and we'll talk about the plague more specifically, especially Comaria, smallpox. Smallpox used to be a huge issue, and even talking about in biological warfare, the United States did that as well as some of Europe when they brought over, but particularly the United States against the Native American. They gave them smallpox infested blankets to stay warm and massacred a huge amount of people. So they've used some of these. Everyone's used, many countries throughout the world have used this throughout the ages. Category B, Brucella, Salmonellas, other E. coli, things like that are considered. Category C, they got the Q fever, ricin, staphylococcal enterotoxin, typhus fever, viral encephalitis, and then some other water safety threats. And then category C, Nipah and hantaviruses. Don't typically see quite as much about those because they're either not that, they're newer and they don't know nearly as much about them and they haven't been used necessarily yet. So those are a list of those. The most important part with this is to recognize when each one is used or what the highest to lowest priority. All right, talking about CBRN. CBRN is an abbreviation for the categories of WMD agents: chemical, biological, radiologic, and nuclear and explosives. We have here cities CBRN unit and how they respond. I do believe that too, but kind of going through there. So CBRN, the science database along with that is the idea behind CBRN in general. This isn't local or national or anything that are just kind of on the national and what they kind of do. They provide coordinated strategic, technical, operational leadership advice guidance for all levels of medical response with focus on medical and public health impacts and interventions relating to CBRN incident. The goal is to improve overall public health emergency preparedness by having systems prepared, responsive, and resilient to the limit of adverse effects of CBRN emergencies. To apply evidence-based decision-making to preparedness, planning for response to, and recovery from a CBRN incident. CBRN, the CBRN asks for science website resource to enhance national preparedness and just-in-time response to focus on medical management for the following groups: radiation emergency, chemical emergency, nuclear detonation, to include state and local plannings. So as we look at most of how they're going, when we kind of get into how most biological agents used in bioterrorism are designed to enter the body, they say one of three ways, but there's really four ways. And we'll kind of talk about. One is the inhalation of small particles into the lungs. This can be either droplet precautions or airborne precautions. Airborne precautions travel further, where droplets have to be in a droplet, but they can still be inhaled. Another thing is ingestion of contaminated food, water, or some other way to get them to ingest things. Third way is by contamination of the skin. That allows for absorption of toxins. Transdermally in the last one is a rare type, but it can still be done by injection. And actually, Russia recently did this, and I actually believe that they injected a radiological agent to inside of someone that walked by, hit him with it real quick, and injected that poison in them, and done. They've done it a couple times. Russia is still out there slow assassinating people on the low. It's some defector from there out in Britain, I believe. The side note aside, continuing on, aerosols. And typically with aerosols, we're dealing with inhalation-based injuries and our disseminations. And so it's delivered in a wet and dry form, composed in a closed or open spaces. And so different ways that they can disseminate these aerosols. Crop dusting planes for open spaces, like we talked about a little bit earlier. Aerosol generating devices, something that basically aerosols it and opens it up to then be many times a threat to go into the ventilation system and then get spread throughout the entire building. And then contaminations of items in the environment with fine powders that are easily aerosolized when disrupted. And this is like looking back at anthrax for you guys who remember the early 2000s, right after 9/11, all of a sudden we had all these issues where anthrax is being sent to Congress people and they'd go to open up a letter, and when they open up a letter, it caused that disturbance, and that disturbance would allow them to breathe in. So there we go. Like all other hazmat incidents, gotta assume they're gonna wear proper PPE. We should be. If you don't know what it is, be prepared to get out of there. If all of a sudden you go up to a big sporting event, for example, and you see a bunch of people running out of there, you should assume to wear proper PPE and that some type of hazmat terrorist incident is going on, particularly if you don't hear any gunshots or anything like that. And by WMD-esque is basically what we're kind of getting at here. Not necessarily shooting or explosive in nature unless you have those indications. But if you see a question that was worded like that, that's what I'd look at. All right, so looking at some of these individual biological threats, anthrax is an acute infectious disease caused by a spore-forming bacterium of B. anthracis. Anthrax most often occurs in warm-blooded animals, however, it can also infect humans. Symptoms of disease vary. Usually, the symptoms are, though, symptoms appear 7 days after exposure. The most common form of anthrax is the cutaneous anthrax. There's a few different ones, but it's the most common and the main issue with this one. Treatments direct person spread to spread of anthrax usually does not occur. Only rare cases of person-to-person transmission are reported when there's been exposure to discharge from open lesions of cutaneous anthrax. Basically, they get exposed to the disease itself, and it's not so much that they that they're spreading it. Unlike some of the other biological issues, it's unless you're getting inside of those lesions that form, you're usually pretty fine. You're typically okay with that. it doesn't spread typically very easily from person to person. So that being said, next we'll talk about botulism. It's a food-borne botulism, which is caused by eating foods that contain the botulism toxin. The second type is wound botulism, which is caused by the toxin produced from wound infected with C. botulism. The third type is infant botulism. Botulism is not spread from person to person. If diagnosed early, food-borne or wound botulism can be treated with an antitoxin. All right, the plague. Plague's still about. I know we talk about it and we think, yeah, like that was back in the older day, like in the Middle East, we had the Middle Ages when we had uh, the Black Plague and all of those things. However, it still comes up yearly usually, and it's typically in many of these Western states that we see it in the U.S. And it's carried by the fleas of rodents, and particularly in these. It happened all the time out in Arizona, where we have a ton of prairie dogs, and those prairie dogs would be carrying fleas that were infected with the plague or I pestis. Plague is found in rodents and then different parts of the world throughout. So the plague is still definitely a thing, and we need to be aware. That being said, we're going to get a little more into plague. There are basically three types of pneumonic plague arising from the lungs, all which are caused by the bacteria. And the bubonic plague arises in the lymph nodes and leads to swelling that produces buboes. Septicemic plague occurs when the lymph infection spreads to the bloodstream. Pneumonic plague is spread through respiratory droplets of an infected person. Patients with the disease should be isolated. Standard precautions and personal respiratory protection for all caregivers is crucial. Bubonic flea rodent to human transmission, septicemic secondary to bubonic or enters through a break in your skin, and most deadly is human to human versus air, and that's pneumonic plague. So plague still out, still kills. Next, after that, we're going to talk about ricin. Ricin is a potent protein cytotoxin, a chemical that is derived from the beans of the castor plant. No antidote exists for ricin poisoning. The treatment is aimed at avoiding exposure and limiting the toxin from the body as quickly as possible. There was recently someone trying to make ricin. It happens all the time, but they'll find something on the internet, something else, with how do you make it, and via the castor beans, and they found it a couple different times, even locally, not too long ago. So always a concern, and all we have there. Smallpox declared extinct by the World Health Organization in 1980 due to near universal vaccination. Signs and symptoms of the disease include high fever, fatigue, headache, and backache. These are followed by 2 to 3 days with the smallpox rash and skin lesion. Treatment: there's no proven treatment for smallpox. Several antiviral drugs have been studied. Smallpox is interesting in the sense that it's still out and about these days, or it's not out and about these days, but there's still a couple places that have it. The CDC in Atlanta has a copy of that, as does somewhere in Russia at their um, wherever they study there and keep their biological weapons and things like that. And so they do keep those around just in case they need to make further antivirus things or for whatever other reason. But it's been basically eradicated from the world as of this time. If there's anyone who is an immigrant, they'll tend to, as part of the process coming to the United States, get a smallpox vaccination. Any of your parents or grandparents might have the one as well, and it gets this big scarce tissue up on your one of your deltoids. And then if you're a military person going to overseas, particularly to a combat zone, they get this one. So I got my smallpox shot. It's pretty gross and wicked. It makes this weird lesion on your shoulder, and if you typically live at home while in the military, they have you not go home and you have to live in the barracks for a couple weeks till that goes away. But it's been more or less eradicated at this point. So continue on. Tularemia is a serious illness caused by the bacterium F. tularemia. The bacterium is found in animals. Disease is highly infectious, and some strains are resistant to antibiotics. The disease is managed with antibiotics, but may require AVCs, airway ventilation and circulation support. You're going to notice many of these times when we start adding how we're carrying it, they're talking about like ventilatory or just comfort measures and just trying to monitor the basics. That's kind of what we're working with here. Is they're just they do whatever we can to support. If we need to tube the patient, we tube the patient, oxygen, ventilation, everything like that. And then circulatory support as well, IVs, pressors, whatever we need to do to try and do that. And if there's anything specific on a couple of these diseases, we'll address those. Viral hemorrhagic fevers refer to a group of illnesses caused by several distinct families of viruses that include the arenaviruses, filoviruses, the Bunya viruses, Paramaxos viruses, and flaviviruses. Um, Therapy of them is supportive, with the exception of yellow and Argentina hemorrhagic fevers, more recently Dengue and Rift Valley viruses. No vaccines that can protect against these diseases. So they're out there. We need to be aware of them and add supportive measures. That's about it. Yes. So nuclear and biological or radiological threats. These can be very interesting and challenging. We note that we have a history of nuclear and radiological going ons in and around the Las Vegas area. It's well known in the past of all the bombs that they used to test out in this area. Enough that there was an entire industry about it in this for locally, and so they nuclear explosions themselves can provide a deadly effect from the explosive, the heat and the blinding light, nuclear, and then the initial nuclear radiation from the explosion of itself. The blast itself fires that are started there, started by the heat pulse, secondary fires caused by the destruction and general collapse of buildings and everything. So nuclear explosions, huge issue. Obviously, like that's a known thing. It tends to radiate areas for quite some time, depending on how long those blasts have been kind of going on. And so, um, huge issue, and try and just do what we can to supportive care. Don't go run into a nuclear blast, please. Hope that's some common sense. Next, let's talk about the dirty bombs. So the dirty bomb is a little bit different than a nuclear bomb. You're no longer having the fission or the splitting of atoms to cause a nuclear explosion. And what instead we're having is material that has radiological properties that causes radiation and causes radiation poisoning. They put this on what we'll call some type of explosive device to disperse that radiation through, and then once it's there, what happens is it then becomes an issue where they need to try and get that. It spreads everywhere and allows people and spreads that the same things that cause the radiation and the radiation poisoning throughout everywhere now causes it to just spread. Anyways, the main type of combines an explosive such as dynamite with a radioactive material, and radioactive materials can be gotten from all over. But an example would be like a hospital. There's radiological items in there all the time, and it'd be semi easier to get that. We talk about detecting radiological issues or items, say for New Year's Eve, and you see those black helicopters flying above. They are detecting the different types of radiation throughout there, and they can actually determine where not only if there's something that is radiating their radioactive material, but they can, due to how sophisticated they are, they can determine like what part of the world that comes from just from as they're flying over trying to find any of those. So if they detect something, they can be like, oh, cool, this is coming from this area, and I can help them figure out what's going on more. So this is an example of a dirty bomb going off. You have that initial release point far on the left side, and then as it starts shifting and the explosion goes, it causes a spread of that radiological material, and then natural wind patterns, then disperse it further depending on where it's at. I think this of I was gonna a fictional map. I had a map at one. I think it was DC getting hit with one, and how the different areas they were looking at. So, uh, it emergency carriers limit the amount of time at that scene. Try and get them out of there as soon as possible, and keep yourself limited. Use aware radiation detection monitors like a Geiger counter. We had some of those when we were doing inspections of the nuclear power plant in Baghdad, and it's and all the material that was still there, and they're going off and all the fun things. If you get exposed, remove clothing in the shower if exposed to dust or some of the sand fallout as soon as possible, because then you can try and limit how much you're being exposed by. So radiation, much like burns, and it is a burn, but in a different burn. Um, One of the biggest things with that is exposure time and um, distance from the material, the type of radiation that you're getting hit by, and the length of time that you're getting exposed to that material. Incendiary threats are weapons that produce heat and fire through chemical reaction of a flammable substance. So many times in the weapons of mass destruction view on things is that so a couple different ways that they tried to hit us with, like, say, IEDs overseas. One I had mentioned in the past was like using chlorine, and we'll go over that here shortly if I didn't already hit it. And then another one was what this was a lot more common. They call it fuel enhanced, and it was the actual fireball, because we know most explosions don't have the actual fireball. It's a big, huge explosion. You see dust and shrapnel go everywhere, but not as much on the fire side. However, when they would use these fuel enhanced IEDs, what they would do is have a bunch of diesel, usually, or gas, something in there. And so when the explosion went off, it would also cause burns, flash burns, and a number of other different challenging situations that we had to deal with. So these can add a ton of fear to that, as well as very difficult patients to try and treat, because you're looking at a large number of burn victims along with inhalation injuries, as well as whatever else was in that explosive device, um, shrapnel, things like that. And then you're also dealing with the burn side, when typically you don't necessarily deal with burns quite as much, usually just the blast injuries. So significant damage to the buildings, infrastructure, of the community. The blast will cause a bunch, and then the follow-on fires will cause worse, overwhelming local resources. And this is why many times the feds get involved very, very rapidly in the case of any type of bombing, um, especially incendiary stuff. Any type of terrorist attack, but especially any type of these fire bombs, things like that, the closing of workplaces, possible restriction of domestic and international travel, the need for evacuation, extended cleanup, and public fear that continue for a prolonged time. White phosphorus is a unique incendiary device. The military uses it. Most militaries end up using it in some source of fashion. Sometimes use it for marking, sometimes they use it for other things. Incendiary devices built with white phosphorus and special concerns. White phosphorus ignites when exposed to oxygen at temperatures above 84 degrees. So if it's on your skin, and it's going to ignite just because your body's warmer than that. So it is a pretty nasty chemical and incendiary burn. And what it does is it causes deep thermal and chemical burns. If fragments of the chemical remain, they can reignite when bandages are removed, because too much exposure to oxygen. We always taught, if you get Willy peat on you or white phosphorus, to go ahead and throw mud on there and keep that down as much. Try and irrigate it out if you can. It's a very challenging device to try and deal with. And certain militaries currently having wars overseas, a couple different ones have been accused of using white phosphorus on civilian populations because, yep. All right. So emergency care in general. Emergency care depends on the nature of the attack. Care include providing care for burns or inhalations at small scale events and it's crucial to remember that not to enter the scene until it's safe. And then we can talk here shortly about secondary devices. So first we're going to hit with the nerve agents used in military conflicts in the Persian Gulf since 1980s, also used in terrorist attacks in Japan in 1995 and Syria in 2017. Sarin's a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid that has no odor in its pure form. It can evaporate into a vapor and spread into the environment. Also mixes easily as water, creating a contamination risk for those who drink or touch water. So it hits a number of different issues. So you can breathe it in, or you can get exposed to it via ingestion of water that's been contaminated with it. In the class, we'll watch this quick movie on the sarin gas attacks in Japan. Next, soman is a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid with a slight camphor odor. The odor is similar to the smell of a topical cough suppressant or rotting fruit. The agent can be vaporized if heated. Taboon is a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid with a faintly fruity odor. The chemical can vaporize if heated. The agent also mixes easily with water, allowing for possible cutaneous exposure and exposure to gastrointestinal tract if you're ingested. So next, we're going to talk about some other VX is a thick amber colored liquid, odorless, odorless liquid. It resembles motor oil and is the most potent of all nerve agents. And we use what we call a Mark 1 kit, but basically it's 2-PAM and atropine. You might have seen these or used them on some of the big events. They usually give them to first responders so they're able to respond and do things. Treatments quickly remove the agent from the body and support the patient's vital functions. Atropine and peroxydoxamine chloride are the antidote for nerve agent toxicity. They are available in auto-injector kits, which was mentioned. We had them all over the embassies in Baghdad. It was just up on the wall, much like you'd see in AED, but instead they just had these kits everywhere. Some other poisonous gases are produced in large quantities worldwide for use in the industrial sector and are widely available. Chlorine is a yellow-green gas with an odor that has been described as a mixture of pineapple and pepper. We've all seen or dealt with chlorine, at least mixed with pools, and so it's all over. There was a recent incident, recent art kind of terms, but there's a number of areas within city or North Las Vegas's area that these guys responded to some chlorine issues. The city fire hazmat and Seaburn unit did. Another one is phosgene, also known as CG gas, and it's a poisonous gas that appears as gray-white cloud and smells like newly mowed hay. If you're smelling these gases, you're having a bad day. No antidotes exist for chlorine or phosgene poisoning besides standard care. Blister agents are vesicants or chemicals with highly irritating properties that produce fluid-filled pockets on the skin and damage the eyes, lungs, and other mucous membranes. Treatment. After ensuring personal safety, initial assessment and treatment of the patient should begin with airway, ventilatory, and circulatory support as needed. These are pretty nasty ones. Like mustard gas is one of those. So next, explosive threats and explosive. So this picture up in the top right was in the Ramadi area. It's just probably 5 or 6 miles away from the base that I was at when this bomb went off. And this was a truck, a semi-truck, vehicle-borne IED, and it was a pretty wicked explosion. It had so many pounds. If we look at the pounds of explosive capacity, roughly 10,000 pounds. That is reinforced concrete, and it just absolutely devastated that bridge. I felt the vibe, like we felt the explosion. We thought it was right outside of our gate instead of 7 miles away. It was one of the biggest explosions I've ever personally been around. And this is what it did to a gigantic bridge infrastructure. Just demolished it. Oh, one of the things you can saw in that previous one was that if you look down on that graph right there, you can see how some safe distances you need to be away from many of those different types of explosives. And if you're outside you have to be pretty decently far away to avoid all the extra issues that kind of come with that. So that being said, categories are basically split into two: low order explosives with velocities less than 300 feet a second, high order explosives above to 3,300, but all the way up to 10 to 30,000 feet a second. They are very huge, big explosives. Typically, we see most high order explosives having to do with military stuff, and most more low order having to do with less military and more homemade stuff. However, both sides can get a hold of either. It's not a definitive. That's just a rough guesstimation, a rough estimation on where you'll see some of those more. And then we have these called IEDs, either low or high order explosives. Overseas, what we saw a lot was the 155 rounds. All the rounds now that Russia's shooting at and Ukraine are shooting at each other, there's a huge stockpile of them everywhere, and they were using those rounds, putting a blasting cap and some other type of arming device in there, and then causing them to go off on all the U.S. troops. That's what the majority of the IEDs were there, and those are typically high order explosives, even though they're used in a homemade manner. But they can contain a fuel, an oxidizer, and projectiles. Typically, the projectiles are there to cause a shrapnel, which can cause all those crazy issues, bleeding, things like that. So between 2000 and 2016, the United States experienced roughly 1,486 casualties from 220 active shooter incidents, and this we obviously know does not include due to the timeline of October 1st and all of that. So we look at some of this, and we can see of these 661 people died and 825 were wounded, and almost 50 or 70% of the incidents ended in 5 minutes or less. It's why there's been that general change of, instead of waiting for all the backup to get there and to go clear and all the SWAT teams there, the officers are taught to go in very quickly and try and eliminate the threat because most of the damage is done in that first 5 minutes. And then many times the shooter will either end themselves or move on. So that's why they're trying to get, or the new goal with most of these is to get people out of our police officers on the scene and trying to engage the suspect as soon as possible to try and limit the amount of casualties there is. So when you look at threat and you're trying to take care of patients during a mass casualty terrorist-esque attack, particularly one with explosives or shootings, use the acronym THREAT. THREAT has to do with threat suppression, making sure that you are not being actively engaged by the shooter or whoever else is there, that the threat is not there. Then you start with hemorrhage control, tourniquets, and then as well as hemorrhagic dressings and in the junctions, rapid extrication from the area, assess the patient, and then transport to the hospital. Pretty overall familiar and shouldn't be anything crazy here from what you're used to seeing. And kind of go over that in just a second. And then next we'll look at Uh, and shooter explosive incidents care begins with hemorrhage control, all the things that we've talked about, using MPA, hemostatic gauze, and tourniquets to quickly get as much done as we can in the shortest amount of time for trying to help the most amount of people that we can. So another thing in here, DHS suggests the following interventions following an IED or active position in recovery, in the recovery position, and if needed with like a face or neck type injury that's related to the airway, look at a quick surgical, or not surgical crike here, but a needle crike for these patients. You can do a needle crike very quickly with what we have. If they're awake and maintaining everything else, but their airway, they got shot in the face and we don't have time to deal with that, a surgical, it's very good for that. So yeah, spinal precautions are indicated feasible for blunt trauma patients, and then IV access if indicated and provider is able to do so. So reasons an A or a medic can really help in these situations. I guess the EMTB IV thing that I have now, but next. And this kind of what I was just talking about there. IO access works great. Give these patients medications and then move on, some pain meds, and kind of move on. In a mass cas incident, because it's a disaster-related incident, a little bit leaner, a little bit less stringent on some of the things that we can do, and you don't need to have a patient on a full monitor when you're giving some of these, when you have so much going on with a large number of patients. We're just trying to help the most out. We're trying to help the most amount of people to provide the best care for the most amount of people. So with that, that's kind of what we're going to go through with there. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, was established through the Homeland Security Act of 2002. Remember all this happening as it went down, and basically it consolidated a number of different agencies to try and help prevent terrorist acts in the future, because one of the big things 9/11 is that there was a number of things that happened where the agencies weren't talking to each other, like CIA, FBI, NSA, were not communicating with each other, and some of that they feel could have been prevented if they had good communication lines and all kind of going towards the same thing. So that's somewhat improved. They've added other things like the Coast Guard, and because Coast Guard doesn't do that many military acts or things, however, they do almost every single thing on here, and so they fit a lot more into that mission profile. So they follow while still kind of considered a branch, they follow more law enforcement and homeland security things, and that kind of makes sense. All right. Many aspects of a WMD incident are comparable to other medical trauma and hazardous material incidents, and we just got to kind of, one big thing is to be aware of dangers to yourself and the others. And so first are secondary responders. So this is not secondary responders, but going after first responders with secondary devices. So they've been timed secondary incidents. And so one example of this, while this was overseas in a combat zone, it still is something that kind of happened. I might have mentioned this previous in the class sometime, but my platoon, I was not part of this patrol at the time. I was attached out to another platoon, but they were driving down the road. They got hit with one IED. The A driver, the guy in the front right seat, was complaining of cervical neck pain. So a bunch of the corpsmen and a couple of the leadership got out, threw him on a backboard, and were carrying him. Unfortunately, the 7-ton device vehicle that got hit landed right on top of the secondary device. So as soon as they saw all the guys unloading the A driver out on the backboard, he blew up the secondary device. It was right underneath the engine, and it caused all that explosion to go outwards and take out, I believe, 5 or 6 of their associated legs, or their legs of 5 or 6 of the different guys. And luckily, because my corpsman at the time, uh, Jeremy Velasquez, was quite a rock star corpsman. He went there and had tourniquets on almost on every leg. He actually got the Bronze Star for his actions that day. He was a rock star, and we only ended up losing one guy, and Corporal Beard got a piece of shrapnel right up into his pelvic area. When they loaded him on the helicopter to medevac him out from there, they think the change in altitude, the vibrations, everything going on just kind of finished bleeding him out through his pelvis, and he ended up coding and dying there. So, but tourniquets work, and also that indication that many times they have that secondary device to try and get the first responders there. And so they got some of our guys. They do it all the time. Boston Marathon, they had other devices set up meant to go after the first responders there. So it's a common tactic to have your first device go off and then have a secondary device ready to hit other people, the first responders with. So contingency plans for emergency responders at the scene and destination facilities need to be in place. These will help emergency responders deal with large numbers, upset, agitated, frightened, injured patients. This is usually above our pay grade, but just know that many times there's plans in place. And so if they tell you to go somewhere to do something, it's usually for a reason and not just to be because they want to or IC wants to say or do something. So kind of talked about this, and then work with the system as best as you can. Uh, Emergency responder guidelines have been established by the Office of Justice Program, Office of Justice Preparedness, and prepare for and respond to incidents of domestic terrorism. They say, so here are some of the things. Recognize hazardous material incidents, know the protocols used to detect potential presence of WMD agents and materials, no self-protection measures for WMD incidents and hazmat events, and no procedure for protecting a potential crime scene, which is everything that we've gone over so far in this class, or in ALS operations. Here, getting talked about. All right, guys, that's it for today. Any questions? Go ahead and let me know. Hope everyone has a great day. There we go.